For 17 years he drove to work every morning, he sat in traffic. He rode the elevator to his Midtown Manhattan office. He reviewed blueprints. He went to his daughter's school events, and then he came home to Massapequa Park, a quiet middle-class suburb on Long Island, where his neighbors waved from their driveways and his kids grew up on a cul-de-sac. For 17 years, Rex Heuermann was the Long Island serial killer, an architect by day. A strangler, a dismemberer, a predator who hunted 8 women across nearly 2 decades, wrapping their bodies in burlap and leaving them on a beach highway a few miles from his own front door. And for 13 of those years, the case went colder. Today I'm covering the full Rex Heuermann case. The Gilgo Beach murders, the discovery that started it all, the evidence that cracked it open. And what happened in that courtroom in June 2026 when the families of his victims finally got to look him in the eye. If you're new here, this channel goes deeper than the headline. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because this is exactly why people keep coming back. To understand this case, you have to start with a woman who was not one of Heuermann's victims. Her name was Shannan Gilbert. She was 23 years old, a sex worker who advertised on Craigslist. On the night of May 1, 2010, she went to meet a client in Oak Beach, a small gated community on Long Island's South Shore. Somewhere in those hours, something went terribly wrong. She called 911. She was on the line for 22 minutes, screaming incoherent, telling the operator they're trying to kill me. And then she ran, into the marshland. Into the dark. Shannan Gilbert's body was found 18 months later in a nearby marsh. Authorities determined she likely drowned. Her cause of death has been disputed ever since by her family, who have never accepted that explanation. As of today, she has not been connected to Heuermann, but the search for Shannan Gilbert is what cracked open everything else, because when police started searching that stretch of Ocean Parkway in December 2010, they found something nobody was prepared for: 4 bodies. Buried in close proximity in the scrub alongside the road. All young women. All sex workers who had advertised on Craigslist. All strangled. All bound with belts or tape at their heads, midsections and legs, and wrapped in camouflaged burlap. They became known as the Gilgo 4. Melissa Barthelemy, 24 years old, from Allegheny, New York. Maureen Brainard-Barnes, 25 years old, from Norwich, Connecticut. Megan Waterman, 22 years old, from Scarborough, Maine. Amber Lynn Costello, 27 years old, from North Babylon, New York. They had gone missing separately between 2007 and 2010. Nobody had connected their disappearances. Nobody had been looking for a serial killer until now, and it wasn't over. Over the following months, police continued to search the area. 6 more sets of remains were found along the same stretch of parkway and nearby locations. In total, nearly a dozen people had been discarded along this highway, some of them dismembered, some unidentified for years. One, a 2-year-old girl named Tatiana Dykes, found alongside her mother Tanya Jackson, whose identities weren't confirmed until April 2025. Long Island had a serial killer. And for the next 13 years, nobody knew who it was. Rex Heuermann had lived in Massapequa Park since the 1990s. He ran his own architectural consulting firm, RH Consultants, out of an office on 5th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. He was well regarded in his field. He'd worked on major buildings. He had a wife, Asa Ellerup, and 2 children. By every external measure, he was a suburban professional, a commuter, a family man, but there was another life running parallel to that one. Hidden in plain sight, when investigators eventually searched his home and devices, here is what they found. Heuermann had an obsessive interest in the Gilgo Beach killings themselves. He had been following the case online for years, searching repeatedly for updates on the investigation. He watched torture pornography. He had catalogued violent sexual material on his devices, and buried in his computer files, prosecutors described what they called a blueprint for murder. A planning document, checklists, how to limit noise during a killing, how to clean a body, how to destroy evidence, what supplies to bring, how to avoid leaving DNA. A man who made his living designing buildings had also designed a system for ending lives. And when investigators looked at how he actually carried it out, the operational detail behind those checklists, what they found was methodical, patient, and calculated in a way that told investigators this was not someone who ever planned to stop. The victims he chose were women who advertised escort services on Craigslist. He contacted them using burner phones, prepaid devices bought to leave no trace back to him. He arranged meetings, and then he strangled them. After killing them, he bound their bodies, head, midsection, legs, wrapped them in burlap, and drove them to that stretch of Ocean Parkway, a road he likely knew well. A beach minutes from his own home. He did this for 17 years. From 1993 to 2010. Across 8 women that we know of. And when the Gilgo Four were found in 2010, when every major news outlet was covering the story, when victims' families were standing in front of cameras demanding answers, Rex Heuermann drove to work. Rode the elevator, reviewed the blueprints and went home. Here is what finally caught him: not a witness. Not a tip, not a confession, a piece of leftover pizza. Stay with me, because the way this investigation cracked open after 13 years of nothing is one of the most remarkable forensic stories in modern true crime history. And it starts with a task force, a garbage can on a Midtown sidewalk, and a decision that changed everything. In February 2022, 12 years after the Gilgo Four were found, Suffolk County formed a multi-agency task force to re-examine the case from the ground up. The Suffolk County Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, the New York State Police and the FBI. Within a month, Rex Heuermann was identified as a possible suspect. Here is how they built the case: cell tower records. A phone number associated with several of the Gilgo Four victims' last known contacts was traced to cell towers, and the movement of that phone matched with disturbing precision the movements of another phone. Rex Heuermann's personal phone. They were in the same places at the same times. Consistently, the green pickup truck. Witnesses near the scenes had reported a distinctive vehicle. Investigators identified a Chevrolet Avalanche registered to Heuermann. It was parked in plain sight, outside his Manhattan office for anyone to see. The hair. Investigators reanalyzed physical evidence from the original crime scenes. A female hair found on the burlap wrapped around multiple victims was subjected to mitochondrial DNA testing. The profile matched Heuermann's wife, Asa Ellerup, not Heuermann himself, his wife, meaning her hair was on the burlap he used to wrap his victims. She was not suspected of involvement, but her DNA being on that material placed those materials, and the hands that handled them, directly inside the Heuermann household. But investigators needed Heuermann's own DNA to make the match definitive, and they couldn't compel him to provide it, not without tipping their hand, so they waited, and one afternoon in 2022, they followed Heuermann through Midtown Manhattan as he finished his lunch. He walked to a sidewalk garbage can and tossed in the remnants of his meal, a box of pizza crusts. Investigators moved in the moment he turned the corner. They retrieved the box. They sent it to the crime lab. The DNA from the pizza crust matched the male hair found on the burlap wrapped around the victims. Rex Heuermann had eaten lunch and handed investigators the key to a 13-year-old cold case. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested. He was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman and Amber Costello, and named as a suspect in the death of Maureen Brainard-Barnes. He was held without bail. He had been commuting past that police station for over a decade. What happened after the arrest was a slow, methodical expansion of the case as investigators dug deeper. January 2024. Heuermann formally charged with the murder of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, completing the Gilgo Four. June 2024. Two more charges: Jessica Taylor, 20 years old, who disappeared in 2003. And Sandra Costello, 28, who was killed in 1993, 31 years before she was finally connected to the man who murdered her. The DNA match came from hairs found on her body. December 2024, Valerie Mack, 24 years old, killed in 2000. A seventh charge. And in August 2023, a woman long known only as Fire Island Jane Doe was identified as Karen Vergata, a 34-year-old escort who disappeared in 1996. She would become the eighth victim Heuermann eventually admitted to killing. I want to stop here, because these names deserve more than a list. Melissa Barthelemy was 24. She had a younger sister who investigators discovered received phone calls from the killer after her sister's death. Heuermann taunting the family, calling to describe what he had done. Megan Waterman was 22. She had a daughter. She had called home the night she disappeared. Amber Costello was 27. Maureen Brainard-Barnes was 25. She had a young daughter she left behind. Jessica Taylor was 20. Valerie Mack was 24. Sandra Costello was 28. She had come from Trinidad and Tobago. Karen Vergata was 34. 8 women, killed across 17 years, wrapped in burlap and left on a highway. And for most of that time, forgotten by the investigation that should have found them. And then, in April 2026, after 3 years sitting alone in a segregated jail cell in Riverhead, reading crime novels, striking up a correspondence with another serial killer, with every legal door closing around him, Rex Heuermann walked into a courtroom and said 2 words that ended it all. On April 8, 2026, Rex Heuermann walked into a Suffolk County courtroom and pleaded guilty. He admitted to strangling all 8 women. He admitted to using burner phones to lure them. He admitted to binding their bodies and wrapping them in burlap. He admitted to dismembering some of them. Under questioning from District Attorney Ray Tierney, Heuermann answered in short, flat sentences. He appeared, according to every reporter in that courtroom, completely unemotional. Matter of fact. As if he were discussing someone else's case, he never looked back at the gallery where the families of his victims sat watching. His defense attorney later said that Heuermann had reached a point where he wanted to spare the families the ordeal of a trial, that he had accepted responsibility and wanted to plead guilty, but the district attorney offered a different framing. Tierney said that 2 pretrial court rulings had effectively ended Heuermann's chances at trial. A judge had ruled that cutting-edge DNA evidence, a first in New York court history, would be admissible. And combining 7 murder charges into a single trial would have had an overwhelming cumulative effect on any jury. The evidence had closed every door. As part of the plea, Heuermann agreed to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to help investigators understand how serial killers operate and potentially identify others still at large. The families were not asked whether they wanted a plea deal. Many of them had waited 13 years or longer for a trial. For the full public accounting, for the evidence laid out piece by piece in front of a jury, they did not get that. On June 17, 2026, Rex Heuermann was sentenced. Before Judge Timothy Maz handed down the sentence, 13 family members of the victims stood up. One by one. And they looked at the man who had killed their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, and they said what they had carried for years. Joanne Mack, the adoptive mother of Valerie Mack, what you have done to our family is beyond what words can express. Amanda Funderburg, sister of Melissa Barthelemy, called him an ogre, a repulsive monster, a demon inside and out. She looked at him and said, "I hope you take a spot in hell because I will see you there." Violet Swadger, cousin of Jessica Taylor, who would have turned 43 that very day, said, "I can't even put into words the eviscerating hatred I have for you." When the statements were done, the judge asked Heuermann if he wished to say anything. He stood up. "There are no words I can say," he said. "The words I would say have no meaning." Judge Maz, I looked at him. "Are you sorry? Are you at least a little bit sorry for what you did for these poor innocent women?" "Yes, I am," Heuermann replied. The judge's response was immediate. "You are a disgusting, despicable and small man, and you are a coward." And then he sentenced Rex Heuermann to multiple consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. As guards led him from the courtroom, family members chanted. A round of applause broke out. "Get him out of here," the judge said. Rex Heuermann, the Long Island architect, the suburban commuter, the father, left that courtroom and was transporting to Green Haven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York, where he will die. There is a question that runs underneath this entire case. The question that the victims' families have been asking since 2010, and that nobody has fully answered yet. Why did it take so long? The Gilgo 4 were found in 2010. Their cause of death was obvious. The burlap, the binding, the method. This was not a case that required years of puzzling over whether a crime had even occurred. There was a serial killer on Long Island. That was not in dispute, but the investigation stalled. Corruption played a role. The Suffolk County Police Commissioner at the time, James Burke, was later convicted of federal civil rights violations and had actively obstructed the FBI's involvement in the case. The former district attorney who protected him, Thomas Spoter, was also convicted of obstruction of justice. 2 of the men who should have been driving this investigation were running from it. And the victims, young women who advertised escort services online, were not, the families felt, treated with the urgency their deaths deserved. Director Liz Garbus, who made the Netflix docuseries on this case, said it directly. The stigma surrounding the victims' work almost certainly slowed the pace of the investigation. 8 women killed across 17 years. And the man responsible lived 15 minutes from where he left their bodies. He read crime novels in his jail cell while awaiting sentencing. He struck up a correspondence with the so-called happy face killer. He sat alone in a segregated cell at Riverhead County Jail for 3 years, reading. The families got their life sentences. They didn't get the trial, and Shannan Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance started all of this, still has no definitive answer about how she died. If this case moved you, if you're still thinking about Melissa, Megan, Amber, Maureen, Jessica, Valerie, Sandra, Karen, share this video. Say their names. Because for too long this case moved too slowly, in part because not enough people were paying attention. Subscribe if you haven't. The next case I'm covering stopped me cold the moment I started researching it. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you there.